Do you like books? I mean, really, really like books? Then you're in the right place. Each week, your host, Sam Hankin, interviews the best of today's top-selling authors and the up-and-coming superstars of modern literature. This is The Avid Reader. Here is your host, Sam Hankin.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another edition of The Avid Reader. Today, our guest is Colonel Terry Virts, author of How to Astronaut, An Insider's Guide to Leaving Planet Earth, published September 15th by Workman. Colonel Virts had one of the most incredible jobs in the world, and an extremely demanding one. He's one of only 4 astronauts ever to fly in the Soyuz, be the commander of the International Space Station, and perform numerous spacewalks. He also took more photographs in space than anyone else in the world, around 300,000, which is amazing. And he primarily assisted and did film the IMAX movie, A Beautiful Planet, which I would highly recommend. I saw it in actual true IMAX form at the Franklin Institute in the Fells Planetarium here in Philadelphia. He also has the third most days continuously, 200 in space, due in part to the failure of 2 rockets from Russia. He's flown over 40 different types of aircraft, and he's taken that experience, one that no one on Earth will ever have again, to a career of writing, filming, and as a speaker and lecturer on both the dynamics of spaceflight and how that experience has led him to a comprehensive understanding of leadership and decision-making processes regarding management and operations and the difference of value in each. How to Astronaut is a book with a table of contents that goes a long way in itself to an understanding of spaceflight and astronautic, if you will, experience. As Terry says, jump in the book anywhere you choose, or read it from beginning to end straight through, as I did in one sitting. Chapters include speaking Russian, emergencies in space, making movies, how to build a space station, and sex in space. So I guess with that last one, I can just say welcome, Colonel, and thanks for joining us today on The Avid Reader.
Hey, it is great to be here with you guys.
So we'll certainly talk about toilets, showers, all the things you always talk about in interviews. But first, I did want to talk, because it was fascinating to me, about the leadership aspect of your experience in space and on the ISS, and how it translates to your career now, because I find that fascinating.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. So part of my career now is speaking and doing consulting for different businesses, and through that, leadership is a big part of it. And I think a career between my time as a fighter pilot and at NASA, I've seen a lot of good and I've seen some bad. So there's definitely some lessons that I've taken away from that. And being the commander of the space station is a really interesting leadership challenge, because you're in charge of this massive tens of billions of dollars machine, international, but there's only so much power you have, because there's a lot of politics in these national space agencies down on Earth. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic of having this really big responsibility, but you have a lot of bosses, to say the least.
Yeah, and one of the big things I took away from the book was when you were on your spacewalk and they asked you to do a go ahead or get ahead task. And
right.
And you kind of criticized, which I found enlightening. And the motto that you use, and I guess all pilots use, is to brief the flight and fly the brief. And that goes into management versus operations. Maybe you could explain it to us.
Yeah, so there's, this basic philosophy that I have beat into my brain as a 21-year-old Air Force jet pilot, that, before you go and fly, you have a briefing and you plan as best as you can for what you're going to do, and what if as much as you can. And then when you're flying, you fly what you brief. You don't just kind of ad lib it and go, oh, hey, there's a bridge over there. Let's go see if we can fly under it. It's something that we call flight discipline in the Air Force. And at NASA, too, it's a really important thing. And on this one particular instance, I had been doing 3 spacewalks in a week. Everybody was exhausted. It was a really busy time. And on this third one, I was the lead spacewalker. We call it EV1. And I had worked out with our flight director, who's the boss down in Mission Control, that we would finish our tasks and then we would come inside. We weren't going to do any what we call get-aheads, or just like extra bonus work. A lot of EVAs, they have get-aheads planned. Or, if you get ahead, if you're ahead of schedule, you can go do this 30-minute, like a honey-do list. And we were just so wiped out, we didn't have time to study for them. We're not going to get ahead. So then at the end of the spacewalk, we were 5 hours into it, finished into a 6.5 hour spacewalk. So we were ahead. I was ready to come inside, and Houston called me up and said, "Hey, can you do a get ahead?" And I was like, "Huh?" We agreed not to do that, but I felt good. I was in good shape. I really didn't want to come in, and then they said, "Hey, can you just go pick up this bag?" Which seemed like a pretty easy task. So I said, "Sure, I can do it. It's not a big deal." Well, it turned out later that there was quite a story of what was actually happening in the room in mission control that I didn't know, that management basically bullied the flight director into doing this. And I was appalled, and everybody was appalled. The whole team of 10 or 20 trainers like couldn't believe what had happened in mission control. And so it was just a lesson. Like it wasn't a new thing. I had learned it, as I said, as a 21-year-old new second lieutenant pilot in the Air Force, but um, it was relearning the lesson that, especially when you're doing something as dangerous as a spacewalk, or any kind of dynamic, dangerous, even in a company. If you're running a big company, you got a high risk operations. You plan what you're going to do, and then you do them, and you're flexible if you need to be, but you just don't want to kind of wing things on the fly.
Yeah, it's kind of like in my building career, dealing with architects versus engineers. Theoretically,
Right.
theoretically, they both want to reach the same goal. Um, yeah, but you know what I mean. And then more tragically, and Richard Feynman's my hero. And when they did the Challenger investigation, you could see that in a more, as I said, tragic sense. Um,
Yeah.
they wanted, yeah. So
The Challenger investigation was the Challenger accident was basically the same accident as the Columbia accident. There was, problem. The vehicle had problems. People knew about it, and they just went ahead and kept on flying. Even though, they did there's you never have an airplane crash or a rocket crash without the vehicle talking to you in advance. Very, very rarely does something just randomly out of the blue that nobody knew anything about. There's always some signal there. There's always, it's talking to you. And yeah, and that unfortunately NASA learned that lesson twice with both shuttle accidents.
yeah, and well, I'll leave that there because, and I know it goes to your career. Maybe we'll get back to that later. But a couple of the other things that I could tell that popped out for things that you really loved doing. One of them was the IMAX film. And
Absolutely, yeah.
talk a little bit about that because, like I said, I've seen it, and I really think everyone should.
Yeah, I love that movie. So yes, and actually the goal of the book is to make you laugh and say wow. So that's kind of that was my goal as an author. I didn't want to write like a typical astronaut memoir. This is definitely not that. And it's not a technical, super in-depth scientific book. Hopefully it's something fun, easy to read, and you'll learn a few things and laugh along the way. But of all the things I love doing in space, I think photography was probably at the top. And having a chance to film the IMAX movie, which I just lucked out, it just happened to happen during my mission, was like the highlight of my NASA career by far. As a kid, I went to the Air and Space Museum, and I saw To Fly. There was I think one of the very first IMAX movies back in 1976. It's an amazing movie. I think the Air and Space Museum still shows it, and it like captivated me as a little kid. So then when I got a chance to film, A Beautiful Planet is the name of the movie we made. It was a opportunity of a lifetime. And Toni Myers was our director. She basically directed all the space IMAX films over the last, going back to 1981, Hail Columbia. And she said, "This is my last film. I'm going to retire." And unfortunately, it was her last film because she passed away last year from cancer. But she was just amazing. She was a great mentor. I had a chance to direct another movie last year called One More Orbit. It's coming out in a few months. A documentary about flying around the planet and setting a world record, and how exploration kind of brings people together. But Toni was a great mentor. And I had James Nyhouse was our director of photography, who had also been the DP for a bunch of space IMAX movies. So having that team was really, really fun. And the funny thing is I never had any time scheduled for this. I think NASA gave me 1 hour on my official, Outlook schedule, if you will, in space, and that was for equipment familiarization, and then filming all the scenes and all the shots for something that we had to do in our spare time. So I wasn't the only guy that filmed it. Some of my other crew members helped film it also, but I was probably the most enthusiastic and took a pretty big interest in it. And what was really amazing to me, I'm the whole left brain, right brain thing. I'm a fighter pilot and test pilot and math major, but the filmmaking aspect of things, it really is creative, much more than the technical. So the taking the pictures themselves was technical, but trying to figure out how to have a story, making sure, you had a scene that was interesting. I thought of a few scenes in that movie, just kind of popped in my head. Do you remember the cookies, the Santa Claus cookies scene?
Yeah, yeah. And you describe that in the book too. Yeah.
Yeah, that was awesome. That was like Christmas Eve, and I was sitting there, and like the light bulb went off, and I was in my crew quarters. So I put my pants on and floated down. I set up this little Santa Claus in the airlock scene, and Tony used it. I was so happy. And there was a bunch of other scenes that I thought of, and hey, look at this. And she was always so polite. She was like, Terry, this is so great. I love it. And then, but we're not going to use it. But that was one of the scenes that made it into the film and survived the cutting floor.
Yeah, it's funny because when I thought of that, and then I thought of 300,000, as they keep mentioning, still pictures. It's like I did a back of the napkin kind of calculation. It's like you took like 1,000 pictures a day. It seemed.
I did. I know. So I just and I never had time scheduled to do that. I don't know if you have Apple TV. There's Apple TV has a screensaver on it that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
And a couple years ago they did pictures from the space station, and I was already retired from NASA at that point, but I helped out a little bit as a consultant on that project. But those guys are my buddies. They were so lucky because they had 50 or 60 hours of scheduled time to go sit in the cupola and take pictures of Earth. I'm like, oh my God, I would have killed for that. Because I all the IMAX movie that I filmed, Beautiful Planet, and all the couple 100,000 pictures I took were on my own time. I'd have to go sneak down in between procedures or whatever at nighttime after work. But it was definitely my passion. It's the way to share, the experience with folks on Earth. And Twitter and Instagram weren't new, but they were sort of newish. So, I tried to share a lot of the photos and stuff with folks back on the planet. And that was my way to connect, just to share it with as many people. I still do, actually. We run through images, and I have someone that helps me with my social media, and she and I will pick out this and that picture and just try and share the story, because there is more than enough bad news nowadays. It's so easy to just turn on the news and get really mad about something. And so I'm trying to provide some positive inspiration. The production company I started to make these film and TV projects I'm working on, my mantra is intelligent inspiration. So it's good to have something positive out there, because there's lots of negative to fill in the gaps if you don't.
Yeah, and you actually kind of made that happen for the other astronauts, because you were the one that installed the cupola in the first place.
That's right. Good memory. Yeah. On my first space flight, it was actually the final assembly mission of the space station. So the shuttle, for 13 years was bringing up these pieces and parts, and I had the honor of being the last official assembly mission. I think, they added on the beam. There's a few other pieces that we'll add on, but as part of that, we brought up Node 3, which is a living module, and also the cupola, which is the most amazing place on Earth or off Earth, because it's where we take all our pictures. You go down there and you can just see the universe and see the planet. It's incredible. It's like the big window that Darth Vader was standing in front of when he had the battle with Luke on the Death Star.
Yeah, I love when you do those analogies. That's the other thing. Yeah. I didn't expect it to be funny, and I didn't expect it to be at times slightly off color, but it really made the book entertaining. And the other thing was, go ahead.
No, I am so happy that you said that, because that was the exact reaction that I wanted. Funny and wow, and yeah, it's not rated G. It's not rated R, I don't think, but
No.
it's not rated. I didn't want a rated G typical astronaut book, so yeah.
The funniest thing was the response to Neil deGrasse Tyson, because it left
Oh
everyone,
God.
no pun intended, in the air.
Yes, it was. It was. Like I said, there. It's good to be on Earth sometimes.
um, yeah, the other thing is like, I watched, and your colleague Samantha, and you could talk about the haircut too, but she was the one who kind of introduced me to the awe of the cupola, because in one of her many videos back to Earth, she was up there, and I said, "Oh my God, finally!" Because when I was a kid, when the first seven argued with Werner von Braun and everybody to get a window,
Right.
spam in a can kind of thing.
That scene in The Right Stuff is great.
Oh, I know. Well,
Yeah.
just to tell my story, when I was a kid, when I was like 11 years old, Shepard, Grissom, Glenn, Carpenter, Schirra, Cooper, Slayton, that was drilled into my head. And then when
Right.
Alan Shepard got Meniere's disease and Deke Slayton had that atrial fibrillation, but he finally got to go. And so I wrote a letter to NASA when I was 11, in 1963, and I wrote about, it was my idea of how to save astronauts. The idea was to put this viscous fluid cushion between an inner and outer hull. So if the hull was breached by a micrometeorite, the fluid would fill both perforations on both sides of the ship. And they wrote me a nice letter back saying, "Thanks so much. We're going to keep your letter on file." And, it was for an 11-year-old kid. It was like a time of my life. It was amazing.
Oh my God, that's an amazing story. You ought to talk to Robert Bigelow, who I've actually worked with. He has this inflatable technology that can do exactly what you're talking about. You should talk to him. Say, look, when I was 11, I came up with this idea.
Yeah, I need, actually, I have patent rights on it. Well,
Yeah.
so, yeah, if you go back to that time, like, and you're standing on the shoulders of giants, like people say, what were you like? You talked a little bit about what you were like when you were a kid, but was this something like, I know you probably heard this too, but was this something like you always wanted to do, or did the opportunity just arose and you said, "Oh, holy mackerel, I can do this"?
Yeah, it was something I always wanted to do. Like I talked about this as a kindergartner. The first book I read was about Apollo, and I was hooked. Growing up, my room was covered with um, pictures and posters of space, and I had all the astronauts memorized, just like you did, and the patches. I knew the Apollo patches, so it was in my blood. And then Star Wars was coming out, and Star Trek, and it's a whole thing. I loved Isaac Asimov. Arthur Clarke is my favorite author.
Me-
All of these guys were just all the whole space thing just captured me at a young age. So I'm really lucky. I got to do what I wanted to do as a little kid. I'm very, very lucky, which I think is part of the reason that drives me to write. I've got this book coming out in a few weeks. I've got a couple other books in my brain that I've started to write outlines for and stuff. And it's such a cool thing, like I said. And we're in this kind of twilight zone of history right now where people think the Earth's flat, and it's everybody hates everybody, and like what is happening down here on the planet. And so hopefully through yeah, I know. And so hopefully through space exploration um uh and inspiration, people can find some common ground. So that's kind of my mission.
So this might be, it's kind of semi-controversial, and you can stop me whenever you want. But I mean, in my mind, Elon Musk, no matter what you think of him personally, I mean, it seems like he's done more in the past 10 years in some ways, and this is where it might sound wrong, than NASA has done in 60. I mean, he's landing boosters, and he's
Right.
landing boosters, he's catching fairings, he's got a ship of 400 feet tall that will hold 100 people. How, don't you think that's kind of strange?
Let's put it in context. So between 2005-ish is roughly when the SLS rocket concept was born. If you remember, after the Columbia accident, President Bush gave a speech that we're going to go back to the moon. And this Project Constellation came about, and as part of that, there was a small rocket to launch people in the Orion capsule. There was a big rocket to launch like the moon ship and the big cargo. The people would rendezvous with the big ship in orbit and then go to the moon or Mars or wherever. When Obama came in, he canceled that program because it was W's program, so it had to be canceled. But the congressman wouldn't let it be canceled. So everything is still around today except for the small rocket. The Orion capsule is still here. The SLS rocket used to be Ares 5, which is where that came from. So this rocket was born in 2005. We spent a couple $1 billion a year on the rocket itself and $1 billion a year on the capsule. The capsule by itself flew unmanned when I was in space in 2014. It's going to fly unmanned again on a half version of the rocket next year, maybe the year after, maybe. And then finally, 3, 4, 5 years from now, who knows, it will fly with people on board. So between when that capsule was born and when it flies for the first time with people is longer than when NASA was born, when President Eisenhower created NASA, and we were finished with the Apollo program. So we went from there isn't a NASA till we're done with Apollo faster than this new government rocket will fly once. Only it's not the whole rocket, it's really only the first stage of the rocket, because the upper stage is a Delta upper stage. So it's that just kind of puts things in perspective with what the government can do and the level of innovation and progress that the government can make. The government's job is to provide jobs in congressional districts, right? That's what government agencies do.
Yep.
Elon, on the other hand, is constantly out of money. He's constantly on fumes. How are we going to make payroll next quarter, right? And so then that's the way most private companies are. They're businesses. The government can raise taxes, companies can't. So he has to get shit done or it's not going to happen, right? So that level of impetus is really powerful. Like hunger is a powerful thing, and when you run a private company, especially a rocket company where it's really easy to go out of business, I think that drives a lot of innovation. So also let's keep in mind when SLS was born, Mike Griffin, who was the administrator, started this commercial program. So NASA gave Elon the seed money, and Elon talks about how that contract that Mike Griffin gave him saved him from bankruptcy was like next week, and He got the contract just in time. So Mike Griffin gave him the seed money, and when I was in space, 2014, 2015, 2 SpaceXs showed up with cargo. So in the same amount of time, basically SLS and SpaceX start at the same time. SpaceX is bringing cargo to the space station 7 years later, and 17 years later, the SLS hasn't even flown once. So that's a really long story, but it puts things in perspective.
It does, and especially like 2 weeks ago when he essentially is launching with one Raptor, it looks like a hot water heater that he's launched. And the gyroscopic capability of that thing, because you can see it tilt a little as it's going up, and then it rights itself. It's just amazing. But anyway, we're here to sell your
cool
book.
Stuff. Yeah. Let's talk about the book. I did put a chapter about space tourism in the book.
Yeah, you did.
The publisher, that wasn't in the original outline, and then he said, space tourism's coming up, and I'm actually talking to. I have some colleagues at Virgin, and I've been talking with them the last couple of weeks. So there's everything in case any of your listeners are going to be one of these space tourists. You need to read this book before you go up because there's some advice in that chapter.
Yeah, and that goes back to, so leading it back to the book, that goes back to some of the chapters that deal with, well, you can talk about, the vomit comet, and we can talk a little bit about the diaper. Yeah, it's interesting. I know you get asked it all the time. That's why I'm trying to steer away from it, but it's still really interesting to people. So let's talk about the vomit comet, and then let's talk a little bit about the diaper and why you don't want to essentially go number 2.
Well, it's funny. Astronauts wear diapers a lot. You got to wear it for launch. You got to wear it for landing. You got to wear it for spacewalks. There's certain times where you're in this suit, you can't get out of it. It's like a big, ironclad a snowsuit you wear in the Philadelphia wintertime when you're 8. And so you can't get out of that thing. So you got to have a diaper on board. And I've never used the diaper ever for any of my launches, for any of my spacewalk training on Earth, forever, anything ever, except my actual spacewalks. Because some guys just dehydrate themselves, which I don't think is smart. So I just drank all I wanted to, and I used it before I went outside. But yeah, the diaper is an important part of American astronaut history. I think it goes back to Alan Shepard's famous situation when he was sitting on the launch pad waiting to go, and it was a 15-minute flight, so why do you need a diaper? But then it was like hours of delay that they hadn't planned on.
Yeah, I know. I felt really bad for him because it wasn't something that anybody expected, and it was a 15-minute flight. So it was like, it was really a shame. And okay, so next, since we're talking about diapers, let's go ahead to the other end, and the vomit comet to start with, and then what happens if you end up upchucking in the International Space Station and you've got this detritus kind of floating around the cabin.
Yeah, that's not what you want. That's a bad day in space. So NASA used to have this thing called the vomit comet, which was amazing. It was the coolest thing. It was an airliner that would push over and pull up and push over and pull up, and you get about 20 seconds of weightlessness while it was pushing over. Unfortunately, they canceled the program because they tried to commercialize it, and it ended up being more expensive and not as good, and they had to cancel the program. But I was lucky enough to do it. So that was my first taste of weightlessness. I think that's the name of the chapter, if I remember right.
Yeah.
But the lesson I learned from that, and again, for anybody who's going to be a space tourist, better living through chemistry. So take the meds, the medicine, these little anti-nausea pills that we have work great, and I highly recommend them. But you don't want, when you get into space, if you show up, it's just going to be floating, and then it'll stick to everything. Yeah, the mess would be awful. So NASA has these pretty cool, fancy, like $500 barf bags that like, it's got a napkin in it and a zip tie, and everything is all there in one thing. So when I went up on the space station for my second flight, I didn't have any problem, but I kept that barf bag in my pocket for about a week, because some astronauts reported, hey, they felt fine, and then all of a sudden, a day or two after launch, suddenly, for no reason, all of a sudden they just would get sick. And your brain really messes with you, and our doctors are still trying to understand exactly what's going on with the brain, and they don't really have a great idea. But there is definitely having those barf bags is a good thing, and taking the medicine is a good thing. So that's the two lessons learned.
Oh yeah, and that leads us into, and I actually heard you in an interview talking about this, about the space brain kind of thing, which is kind of scary because you got to do a lot of stuff.
Okay, so space brain is this common phenomenon. I think just about every astronaut will talk about it and agree that to some extent you experience this. I think it's a combination of you're disoriented, you don't know which way is up or down. You feel just you're floating. It's like an alien experience. You don't get this on Earth ever. And then on top of that, you get carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is higher in space, and that messes with your cognitive abilities. And so the combination of the CO2 and the spatial disorientation, it just slows you down. Like sometimes it'll take you longer than you think to do a task, or you can't remember something. I mean, you experience that on Earth sometimes. Like I was at the grocery store yesterday, and I'm standing in this aisle, and I'm like, I know there was something I was supposed to get. I can't remember it. Everybody gets that. You walk into the closet. Well, now what was I here to get? But it's that it's like that, only magnified and more frequent in space. So if tasks normally take you an hour, you kind of give yourself an hour and 15 minutes or whatever. Just give yourself some margin when you first get there, and eventually it gets better, but never perfect, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sure. Look, I'm 68, so it's gonna get worse for you too. But I read something that says you're okay if you lose your keys, but if you lose your keys and you find them in the freezer, then you got a problem.
For years, I work at home now, which is great. But when I used to, at NASA, I'd bring my lunch. The way to not forget your lunchbox, put your keys in your lunchbox in the
I
fridge.
I do it every day.
Then you can't, go home without your lunchbox. And so
I know.
that was my technique.
But talking about space brain leads me into another question that's very personal to you, which is, I mean, you did a good job because you really exercised before, you really exercised after, and you really exercised during, notwithstanding the Canadarm problem. But
Right.
So have doctors noticed anything with your eyes, anything with osteoporosis, anything with muscle atrophy since you've been back?
The muscle and bone problem, I haven't had any problems at all. I'm active. I don't run, but I jog. And I swim, 1,000 meters a day when the pool's open. And so for me, that aspect of spaceflight has been solved by the exercise machines. I think there's a chapter or two on this in the book. Bone and muscle loss would be really severe. And I think some guys have problems with it. I was lucky. I think my body is just designed to work in space. But I was also diligent about working out every day. And I think the more diligent you are, the less problems you have. The real problem, and some people have had eyesight issues, and that was the big focus of study when I was in space. But I think the one elephant in the room is cancer. And you just get radiation in space that doesn't exist on Earth, unless there's a nuclear bomb going off. And that radiation can damage your DNA, and that can lead to cancer. So I learned after my mission, and this was really disappointing, that NASA doesn't really study that at all. They study how much radiation there is. We really know, we have a good idea of the radiation flux, like the doses of radiation that you get, but we don't have a good before and after look at our DNA. I've asked our doctors, and they're like, yeah, we don't study that, because I guess they're afraid that astronauts, they would say it's a privacy issue and whatever. I don't know. I'm just a fighter pilot. I'm just a fighter pilot. I'm not a doctor.
Yeah, but it's like, that's what they kind of ignore that when they're talking about going to Mars. I mean, can you imagine? I mean, you're talking about 18 months there and back. It seems like the most dangerous aspect of the flight, but who knows?
It is. In a flight full of there's a lot of ways to die on a trip to Mars, but radiation is definitely one of them. And which one of the reasons why I wrote a chapter about this. It's one of the reasons why I think you need to get there and back in a year, and not the current 3-year, I guess, philosophy.
Yeah. And I've read about that too. The other thing that was really interesting and brought it home to me was, and it might not have been the radiation aspect of it, but it made me feel this way, is when you talk about how mission control, when you're doing a spacewalk, tells you, hey, 2 minutes till sunrise. And you talk about the differential in heat and cold, and that one time where you felt so hot and it felt like you were being irradiated by a type of heat that was different than the normal heat you would feel.
Yeah, that was a really cool time. They give you a briefing beforehand. Hey, you're going to feel hot at this point. You're going to feel cold at this point, because they know the sun angles and where you are and blah, blah, blah. So, and the one time, all of a sudden, I was like, started tingling. I'm like, I'm getting cooked. And it wasn't like normal heat on Earth. I'm in Texas right now. It's 1,000 degrees outside. It wasn't like that. It was like an infrared radiation kind of heat. But, and then as soon as the sun set, the heat went away, and I moved out of this location, and I was fine. Another time I got cold, the exact same time they told me I was going to feel cold. I could see the sun was about to rise, and as soon as the sun came up, the cold instantly went away. It just warmed me up right away. So that was pretty cool. I was impressed. Our engineers were pretty good. They were on the top of their game for sure. They knew exactly when I would have these feelings, and I did.
Yeah, and a funny thing, the book was fascinating in so many different ways. But one of the things that was really cool was like some of the things you kind of said, I can't tell you what this felt like, and you can't.
Yeah.
There's nobody that's going to be in that position that you were in ever again. And yeah, you can't describe it. And I wish I could feel it, but I know, and it's just,
There's some things that are hard to describe. Like, what does a strawberry taste like?
Yeah, exactly what you said. And that reminded me, since we both like science fiction, of this one story where this guy gets to go to a planet and they have another sense, like sight. And they tell him, we can give it to you for an hour, but it's not a good idea. And he says, no, he goes, I still want to experience it. And it was the most sublime thing that he could ever experience. And after an hour, it went away. And he spent the rest of his life longing for that.
Right.
Kind of a tragedy.
That is an interesting, that's a great storyline. I like that.
Yeah, it really was. But, talking about the sun and heat and things like that also remind me of another poetic aspect of the book, which is when you describe, which I had no idea. And I thought and you did talk about looking for landmarks on Earth, but I never understood the concept of the colors, the different colors of the oceans, the different colors of the deserts. If you could describe briefly how because no one's going to understand that unless you.
Yeah. Well, I didn't expect this at all, but I started to realize after you spent a few days and weeks and they turned into months in space, is that I really got to know Earth by color. The very first sight I saw in daylight, I launched at 4 a.m, so it was dark. But as we flew into sunrise, I could see the blue atmosphere. Before sunrise, you get this blue band for a few minutes, and it was just profound. It was so gorgeous. It was a color, it was a shade of blue that I had never seen before, and that was something I did not expect. And that continued. When we finally installed the cupola, we opened up all the window covers, and I was working in the station, and I think I shared the story of how all of a sudden the station was just flooded with this red, orange, pink glow. And I was like, what the heck's happening? I went down to the cupola, look out, and there was Australia. It was the Australian outback. And every time for the next 7 months I spent in space, whenever you fly over Australia, the station turns red if you've got the windows open. Well, not if you have the windows open, it won't last for long. But if the window covers are open, and there's just different colors, like Canada and Russia are white. There's just snow for thousands and thousands and thousands of miles and ice. Each of the oceans kind of has a different dark blue look. There's a lot of islands with this turquoise and aqua color, especially the Bahamas and the Caribbean is the most blue, aqua, turquoise place on the planet. It's spectacular. It was the cover of my first book, View from Above, the Nat Geo photography book.
Yeah, and that's
I could go on and on. I could go on and on.
And again, it just goes back to the concept of a beautiful planet. And again, you describe it well enough that you can get an idea of it, but you can't experience it. But the movie does as close as you can get to doing that. No question about it.
I think the closest experience I've had of space flight on Earth is an IMAX, the beautiful planet. It's the best. Unfortunately, you can't see them in IMAX theaters right now. Hopefully, one day soon you can. Although Disney, which owns Fox, which owns Hulu, which owns IMAX, is now letting they just are streaming 16 IMAX films on Hulu, so you can actually watch Beautiful Planet on Hulu, or you can get a Blu-ray. I mean, the TVs that people have nowadays are, for the most part, pretty good. It's not the same as an IMAX screen, but you can at least see the film. Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing was, it's like you every once in a while you stick in a chapter that you kind of like. Well, two chapters, and the easiest one is the almost emergency ammonia situation 2 times in short succession, and then the second one, if you could touch both of them. The second one is, the morbid idea of what happens if one of you kicks the bucket in space.
That so the book has a combination of things you'd expect, like how to do emergencies in the space shuttle, how to do spacewalks, and then some things that you wouldn't expect in a typical space book. And one of them was, what would you do with a corpse, if your crewmate died. I don't remember training. A few of my colleagues have said that they remembered getting training on this. I don't, but it's an interesting thing. And guess what? Like, people die. That's one of the things that we do. is we die. And so the longer we spend in space, eventually it's going to happen. especially since a lot of the astronauts tend to be, in their 50s or even 60s sometimes. And that's what happens. And so I just talked about, if it happened on the station, what would you do? If it happened on the moon, what would you do? That was just one of many chapters that I tried to kind of what if, how do you get to Mars? What do you do with a dead body? What if your engine doesn't light up to bring you back to Earth? What would you do?
They have that
Yeah.
that speech now that they have deep fake and they can copy anybody's movements, whoever.
Oh God, yeah.
They have a deep fake of Nixon giving that speech as if they died, and
I just saw that. Yeah.
It's scary. I mean, it's scary that they can do it, and it's going to get scarier too.
About 10 years ago, I remember thinking, this CG is getting really scary, and there's going to come a day when we're not going to know the difference. And that day is here. That day is here, folks. Like, you can.
I know. And
that one of the projects, kind of my second book project, was a replication of the Apollo 11 flight plan.
It was great.
It's amazing. It's amazing. You see ApolloFlightPlan.com. It's on a website. It's the coolest thing. It's the company that does all the head of state gifts. When the president goes to visit the Pope or the Queen, they make the gift. So they reproduced the Apollo 11 flight plan. And in the back, we put some pictures from Apollo, and one of the pictures was a copy of the speech that Bill Safire had written for Nixon, and it gives me goosebumps seeing that speech there. Thank God he never had to give that speech, but it kind of brings this magnitude of the situation to light for sure.
Yeah, and also the idea that how did we do it? Because the computing power you had on Apollo 11 was, the phone that you just muted and put in your pocket has more computing power.
Oh, by a lot than the Saturn V did, of course. Yeah, I know.
Amazing to me.
Yeah, it is.
Talk about the before we let go. Talk about the ammonia, why it's so incredibly fatal if it happens, and how the Russians can save your ass.
Yeah, it's just a great story of American technology versus Russian technology. And as Americans, we're the best. We're the what's the term I'm thinking of? American supremacy or whatever, But ammonia, we're the exceptionalism, American exceptionalism. So, and we do have amazing technology. So on the space station, we use ammonia as our coolant fluid. Just think about your radiator in your car. It's a good fluid for its thermal properties. It can transfer heat, which is great. It works well in the vacuum of space. So a lot of things about ammonia are really good. The problem is, when I was training how to handle emergencies, my NASA trainer said, hey, they would bring in like a can of cleaner, Mr. Clean or whatever it is, and here's what it smells like, and so you'll know what ammonia smells like. But then they said, but if you smell it, don't worry about it because you're going to die. So ammonia is a really deadly thing. And I live here in Houston, Texas. There's a lot of chemical plants. If anybody works, you're in Philadelphia, there's, refineries and stuff. So if you work in that industry, you know that ammonia is super, super, super bad. You don't want to be around it. So thankfully, the Boeing engineers made a great space station, and it's really hard for the ammonia to leak, but it's possible. Theoretically, it could happen. So we actually had the ammonia alarm went off for the first time ever. We thought the station was going to die. It's a great I think I wrote a chapter about that in the book. But
that's great.
But on the Russian segment, they use glycol, which is like sugar water, as their coolant fluid, which isn't as good. It doesn't have the same thermal properties. But the advantage is it doesn't kill you dead. So it's just a great example of, the Russians, their systems aren't as capable and fancy and big and powerful, but they work. The space shuttle was amazing. It did unbelievable stuff, and it killed 2 crews. Of course, the Soyuz had 2 fatal accidents too, but those were, 50 years ago. And it can't do as much, but it's pretty simple. It's pretty reliable. They've had the rocket blow up and the crew survive. They've had the Soyuz come back backwards with the heat shield in the wrong direction, and the crew survive. So they build things that aren't as fancy, but they have a lot of margin in them, and they're simple. And there's something to be said for that.
Sure, they're still flying their first spacecraft.
They're flying the one. It was a Soviet ICBM, and it still works. You know, they've flown it thousands of times, and it only blows up about 5% of the time, which is pretty good. So, yeah, it's an interesting the difference between our design philosophies, and frankly, having a space station with both. You know, you got this reliable system. But my favorite analogy is the water system. The American water recycling system is super complicated. I spent an entire week repairing it twice during my 200-day flight. The Russian water system is a tank. It's got a handle, and you pump up the handle, and then there's a rubber hose that you drink water out of. So like it just couldn't be more different. There's a tank full of water that you drink out of, or there's this super, super complicated. But what the American system does is amazing. It recycles urine and humidity and turns it into oxygen and water, and it's an amazing system. It's complicated and it breaks. So if you have both, you always got the Russian backup and use the American, you know, for most of the time, and use the Russians when you need it. It's kind of a good marriage.
Yeah, it's like, you know,
vive la différence.
Oh yeah, I forgot to talk about your French minor. We don't have time for that. But the Russian stuff always reminds me of, like, you know, you can go to the Metropolitan themed ball where everyone's wearing $100,000 dresses, or you can look at those pictures, black and white, of some heavy set Russian woman with a babushka. That's the difference right there.
That's another analogy, yes.
Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I think we've covered a lot, but what I would tell the listeners is, this table of contents, you could seriously, let's see what we got. We have 51 chapters, and each of their headings, you know, that's another cool thing you did. Each of the headings really describes you're going to find out. And like you said, Terry, you can just jump in anywhere, which was a nice thing to say to the reader. But, you know, I found that it was much more fun reading the whole thing from start to beginning, because it does have a chronological viewpoint. So again, thanks so much for taking the time today.
Yeah, this was so much fun. I'm glad you enjoyed the book. I'm glad you found it. Yeah, I organized it by mission phase. So like you start off in training, and then you go to launch, and then you're in orbit. So I tried to. There's a little bit of organization to it, but you can't. If you're sitting at the beach, chilling out at Ocean City or whatever, you can just get the book out or on the nightstand next to the bed. I'm curious, how long did it take you to read it? I'm a really slow reader, but I'm assuming in this job, you're probably a pretty fast reader.
Well, plus I own an independent bookstore, and I do like 5 of these interviews a week. So yeah, but when I was a kid, same age as when I was memorizing the astronauts, I took the Evelyn Wood speed reading course. So thank God for that. So it only took me like 3 hours. I mean, maybe less, because I just didn't stop, you know. I just sat in the library. My kids and my girlfriends came in. I said, I'll be done in a minute. And yeah, because, you know, each chapter, if you read it properly, it's really going to be 5 or 10 minutes. And when you're done, you actually have the story in your mind, and you're probably going to remember it for a long time. So again,
I'm so happy to hear that.
Okay, with that slew of compliments to you, it's a good time to stop. All right. Thanks a lot, Terry. I really appreciate it.